I want to talk about the African identity as Egyptians. A lot of times when I talk about this topic on my page, I get comments from different Egyptians from all walks of life, in and outside of Egypt, all ages, who say stuff like, I identify more with culture than with geographical location, and we have more in common with West Asians or Middle Easterners than we do with other Africans. And the thing is, I do understand the sentiment of identifying more with culture or with ethnicity or with language or religion more than you do with geographical location. That's why I personally, as a Saudiya, like a Southern Egyptian, find a lot in common, more in common with Sudanese than I do with Iranians, for example, who are Middle Easterners. However, I find this argument in general flawed because how do you know if you have more in common with West Asians than you do with other Africans if you actually don't seek to learn about other African cultures? And I understand that learning about or knowing, cultures from West Asia is easier because of the accessibility of the language. We all speak like a same like the basis of the language is the same. We all speak vastly different dialects, but at the end of the day, we do to some level understand each other. Did you know that so many of our Egyptian indigenous traditions we share with other East Africans? And not just traditions, also history and foods and all that kind of stuff. The amount of times I've seen East Africans in my comment section when I make a video about, Egyptian traditions or ancient traditions that we still do today or like specific foods. The amount of East Africans I have in my comments telling me that, oh my God, we do this too, or we have this too, and we just have this tiny little detail that is different, or we add this ingredient or whatever. There is so much we have in common. And it's not just East Africans, by the way. Like, I was so shocked to find out that even in West Africa, they eat molokhaya. I mean, it's not called molokhaya, it's called ewedu soup, but it is molokhaya. We share very similar values. Most of us share similar religions, as in, Islam or Christianity. We have a lot in common with each other. The one thing that stands in the way, and I think you know it, is xenophobia and racism. And I really had to unpack these things for myself as well because I was also raised this way. I really had to go back and unpack my upbringing and the way that I was socialized. And I did come to the same conclusion. It is internalized racism and xenophobia. I did have to work on myself as well. And I came up at the end of that proudly African and even more loving of myself and my identity that incorporates different things, that represents all of our history and culture and religion. And I really do think that it made me accept myself more, to really face myself with these things and question. So what do you think?
So that's Manal, and she's great. She's a content creator and activist, and she's a rare breed amongst modern Egyptians. Of course, there's lots of racism in modern Egypt. I cover this topic more in depth in my last video. Most Egyptians wouldn't even begin to acknowledge their relationship to Western and Eastern Africans. Most don't even acknowledge their own Africanness, as Manal states, most viewing themselves as Middle Easterners instead of Africans. So that leads to a lot of racism and discrimination in modern Egypt against modern black Egyptians, which there are millions of. And yes, there are still millions of black Egyptians. And no, they're not all Nubians. Nubians are not the only black people in Egypt. Many Upper Egyptians, or Saidi, are often interchangeable with Nubians and other black people. Many of the citizens in Siwa in Lower Egypt are just as black as the Nubians or black people from anywhere. And once again, I go over this in great detail in my last video if you haven't seen it. I recommend go checking that out. When we look at photos and videos of Egypt from over 170 years ago, from the 1800s and early 1900s, we see that Egypt, especially Upper Egypt, is 100 times blacker than it is today. We see massive crowds of black Egyptians in Upper Egypt. Upper Egypt looks like a completely different country. And there are hundreds and hundreds of photos from this era that look just like this, that are filled with beautiful black Egyptians. The reason that Egyptians are nowhere near as black as they were almost 200 years ago is mostly because of more recent European colonizations, mainly the French occupation and the British colonization. and its effects on both the population and psychology of the Egyptians. And this would have a very dramatic effect on the populations of Egypt, especially Upper Egypt. And once again, I go over this in much more detail in my last video. This occupation is why Manal is so surprised she has shared customs and culture with people in West Africa and East Africa. Her, like a lot of Egyptians, have been taught a version of Egyptian history that has been purposefully removed from Africa.
What archaeologists do when they pull material from the ground or when they translate texts, they bring their own cultural baggage to that interpretation and the baggage of the times that they live in. And so it's imperative that we go back and continually reassess the things that we take as facts. Many of the early archaeologists came to the study of ancient Egypt and ancient Nubia from the perspective of Semitic languages or the study of the Hebrew Bible. And it was very important to them to bring Egypt specifically into the sphere of biblical studies. And so they had to carve Egypt away from Africa to bring it into that sphere. And the way that they did that was they used race. So these early archaeologists effectively made ancient Egypt white in the sense that they made it part of a dominant Western culture, and ancient Nubia was separated from that. It was black. And this was how they took Egypt out of Africa and put it into this Semitic sphere, this biblical sphere. And it's only in recent decades, the last 3-4 decades, that Egyptology has really moved away from that. And scholars who are studying Nubia are really given the chance to give a voice to this Nubian material that it wasn't given much of a chance to have in the past.
So, it's been known for decades that the Egyptians came primarily from two places, that being the Sudan and the Green Sahara. The early Egyptians being comprised of several different Africans from all over the continent. The original Egyptians were black Africans, and even today there are still millions of black Egyptians who are proud of their skin color, proud of their features, proud of their hair textures, and will tell you they are proud to be black and African.
Egyptians are black. The real Egyptians are black because the real Egyptians, they are real Africans. So those people in Lower Egypt you see in Cairo, Alexandria, and the Falahins area, they were mixed between the Turkish, Mamluks, French, English, Romans. So those people who come to attack Egypt in that time, they couldn't come to Upper Egypt, to the south, which we still have the same color, our dark color or black color. So they couldn't mix with us.
Next question. Okay, what question?
السوريين أصليين اللي هم السمر إنما البيض اللي كلهم you see I explained to him about the Nubians and the Egyptians. They were not white, they are black Africans. So he say now ليه هنا الناس لسه سمر في الصعيد وفي بحري بيض.
بحر دولة مش أصلا مش أساس مصر خالص.
He said the people in Lower Egypt, most of them they are not Egyptians. They are Greeks, Francois.
There has always been black Egyptians. The very first Egyptians are black. And the populations of dynastic Egypt came primarily from two places, that being the Sudan and the Green Sahara. This is well attested in the archaeology and has been known for decades. I recommend you watch my whole documentary on the African Neolithic, the Aqualithic, to understand this often ignored period of African history. The Nubian people are the most native of all Egyptians. They are, in fact, the original inhabitants of the Nile Valley, and no population has lived on the Nile Valley longer than them. Their lineages go back over 100,000 years. Egypt is, in fact, a Sudanese civilization. There are several thousand years of cultural development that took place in the Sudan before Sudanese people migrated into Egypt. These early Sudanese migrants into Egypt were called the Badarians. This occurs during the era of the Green Sahara. For centuries, the Sudan and Upper Egypt constituted a single cultural area, known as the primary pastoral community. To quote Vogel, the period when sub-Saharan Africa was most influential in Egypt was a time when neither Egypt as we understand it culturally, nor the Sahara as we understand it geographically existed. Populations and cultures now found south of the desert roamed far to the north. The culture of Upper Egypt, which became dynastic Egyptian civilization, could fairly be called a Sudanese transplant. The Nubians first migrated into Upper Egypt in about 4400 BC, over 6,000 years ago. At this time, the world looked very different than it does today. To put it bluntly, it was a much blacker place. For example, this is what most people in Europe looked like at that time.
With ancient genomes, we get to predict how ancient people looked, what diseases they might have been susceptible to. We can look at what pigmentation profiles they've had. There's been some really surprising results. So the Irish hunter-gatherer population don't have any of the mutations associated with light skin. We predict that they probably actually had quite dark to black skin. But what we also find in Irish hunter-gatherer genomes is a suite of mutations that are associated with blue eye colour. These individuals might have had quite a striking pigmentation profile that we don't really see today.
These are old Europeans, descended from the same out-of-Africa migration from 40,000 years ago. This is before the Indo-European migrations that largely replaced and subsumed these populations and brought Indo-European languages into Europe and Asia. It should be noted that these people didn't just look black, they were black, as the Green Sahara was the largest out-of-Africa migration since the original out-of-Africa migration that populated the Earth. During this period, Africans had migrated throughout the Mediterranean, throughout Europe, throughout the Levant, and all the way into India and Asia, and of course into Egypt as well. So the ancient Egyptians were a mixture of several different Africans. This is seen prevalently in the genetics of modern North Africans. We see genes from West Africa and East Africa and Central Africa and South Africa. This is why sickle cell anemia is so prevalent in modern Egypt. The haplotype the Egyptians possess is the Benin or Nigerian haplotype, which originates in Benin, Nigeria. All sickle cell alleles originate in Western Central Africa, and the Benin haplotype occurs in modern Egyptian populations at about 80.8%. That's because West Africans that once lived in the Green Sahara migrated into the Nile Valley about 5,000 years ago. But these haplotypes aren't only found in modern populations. The Nigerian haplotype was common amongst ancient Egyptian populations. We find pre-dynastic mummies from over 5,000 years ago, dating back to 3,200 BC, with these same sickle cell alleles. Note that this is right around that time that people started migrating in from the Green Sahara. To quote Panzer et al., molecular investigations on ancient Egyptian mummies from the Anthropological and Ethnographic Museum of Turin, Italy, have reported evidence of sickle cell anemia in 3 pre-dynastic mummies, and the evidence of a hemoglobinopathy, possibly thalassemia, in 1 mummy. Additionally, the presence of a brushed skull and extensive bone pathologies characteristic of hemoglobinopathies and thalassemias have been observed. This is also why we find West African Y chromosomes in ancient Egyptian mummies. This is haplogroup E1b1a. It originates in Western Central Africa. It is the dominant haplogroup of Bantu Niger-Congo people, and it is the paternal line of Pharaoh Ramesses III. and other royalty like Pintaware. Thus, we can see West African people were a part of the founding populations of ancient Egypt. Since the Benin haplotype is the dominant strain of sickle cell anemia in Egypt, all these thousands of Egyptians, both modern and ancient, are descended from Nigerian people. Sickle cell anemia is a genetically inherited trait, and to get it, both your mother and father need to be carriers of the sickle cell trait.
It's a group of disorders. The most important genetic change makes the hemoglobin, which is the red protein we're talking about in the red cells. It's called hemoglobin S, and if you inherit that gene change from one parent, you don't have any illness. You're called a healthy carrier for sickle cell because you can pass it on to your own children. If you inherit S type from both your parents, that's when most of the problems, so hemoglobin SS, both parents, that's the worst form of the condition. 2 healthy carrier parents will have, for each pregnancy, a 1 in 4 chance that that baby will have sickle cell anemia. And 50% chance they'll be a carrier, which doesn't matter, and 1 in 4 chance that they will not have any S at all. So it's 1 in 4 children who are affected.
So all Egyptians with that Benin haplotype are of Nigerian ancestry on both their mother and father's side. We also see other sub-Saharan African populations, such as Southern Africans, buried in cemeteries in pre-dynastic Upper Egypt. At Adaima, in this pre-dynastic burial site, we find the remains of several Khoisan. This is not surprising, as the Khoisan used to live in the Green Sahara amongst populations of Nigerians. Today, Khoisan genetics are found frequently in the Igbo people of Nigeria. Given the prevalence of the Benin haplotype and sickle cell anemia amongst the Egyptian people, and the Igbo people's relation to the Khoisan, it is not surprising at all to find the remains of Khoisan people in these early pre-dynastic graves. To quote Krubezi, one of the peculiarities of the population of Adaima highlighted during a preliminary study is the important frequency of upper canines called bushmen, which present a very frequent anatomical variation in certain African populations, especially the Khoisans. The African origin of the population, already widely suspected, Krubezi et al. 2002, is here confirmed. Not surprisingly, the modern inhabitants of Adaima still bear the genetics of their ancient sub-Saharan ancestors, most notably the L0 haplogroup, which is found most commonly today amongst the Pygmies of Western Central Africa and the Khoisan of South Africa. These L0 haplogroups found only within sub-Saharan Africa. To quote Keita et al., sub-Saharan African affinities of modern Egyptians from Abusir el-Malek might be attributed to ancient early settlers, as there is a notable frequency of the Bushman canine, deemed a sub-Saharan African trait in pre-dynastic samples dating to 4000 BC from Adaima, Upper Egypt. Haplogroup L0F, usually associated with Southern Africans, is present in living Egyptians in Adaima and can represent the product of an ancient ghost population from the Green Sahara that contributed widely. So, as we can see, Black Egyptians are the original Egyptians, the populations of dynastic Egypt coming from the Sahara and the Sudan. And the Nubians we see today in Aswan and in Upper Egypt are not foreigners. They are native to Egypt, and in fact, they are the founders of Egyptian civilization. So, since the Egyptians were composed of several different Africans, ranging from West Africa to East Africa, there's lots of shared cultures and customs between the Egyptians and their African neighbors. As Manal stated earlier, one of the shared foods between the Egyptians and their African neighbors is mulakaya. Mulukaya is made of jute, or Cocorus olitoris, which has been cultivated for millennia and grows wild or as a crop in every country in tropical Africa. Mulukaya, as Manal states, is called Iwidu soup in Nigeria by the Yoruba. It's called Morinda by the Luo in Kenya, and goes by several different names across Western and Eastern and Southern Africa. There's lots of shared culture and customs between the Egyptians and their African neighbors. And there's lots of shared crops and foods between the Egyptians and their fellow Africans. That's because Black people from all over Africa were a huge part of the Neolithic Revolution. They not only made up part of the populations of the Natufians, who lived in the Levant and were some of the oldest farmers on Earth, Africans deep inside of Africa created agriculture independently during the Neolithic. As these Africans migrated out of the Green Sahara, they brought with them a slew of crops that would become staples around the world. And upon the drying out of the Sahara, these Africans migrated into the Nile Valley, bringing with them native crops from all over the continent, domesticated animals, domesticated plants, fruits, and vegetables from all over Africa. Thus, there is a slew of agricultural contributions from both Western and Eastern Africa that came with these African migrants into Egypt from the Green Sahara. One such crop was the roselle, or Hibiscus sabdorifa, first domesticated in West Africa, where it's known as Isapa by the Yoruba or Akworo Ozo by the Igbo. This crop spread far and wide from West Africa all the way to India, where it became a staple for millennia. As in West Africa or India, the ancient Egyptians used hibiscus for certain soups and teas. In ancient Egypt, these West African flowers became associated with lust and amorous behavior. Women were in fact forbidden from drinking hibiscus tea, as the Egyptians believed that the red hibiscus tea could induce promiscuous and licentious cravings in women. It played an important role in traditional medicines and spiritual rituals, and is still often toasted at weddings in Egypt and Sudan to this day. The word hibiscus itself originated in Egypt, meaning plant that is consecrated by the ibis, a bird that was held in sacred reverence by the ancient Egyptians. Another West African crop spread early on to the Nile Valley, that being the black-eyed pea. First domesticated in Nigeria over 6,000 years ago, this tasty West African legume spread far and wide throughout the Mediterranean as far as India and even deeper into Asia. In ancient Egypt, they took on a special significance. Eating black-eyed peas was thought to show humility before the gods, and today they are a staple of Egyptian cuisine. Lubia, a flavorful traditional Egyptian stew, consists of black-eyed peas, beef, onions, and tomato sauce, and is a staple in Egyptian homes. Another crop that spread from deep in inner Africa into Egypt and beyond was the watermelon. This delicious fruit would of course become world-renowned and spread far beyond Africa, its origins lying in East Africa, most likely in the regions of Somalia and the Horn of Africa. Some of the earliest depictions of watermelon can be seen painted on the walls of ancient Egyptian tombs. Even thousands of years ago, it had its distinctive shape, striations, and subtly sweet taste. But not only crops spread from inner Africa to Egypt, but domesticated animals as well. Perhaps one of the most important domesticated animals of the Neolithic, the donkey, was first domesticated in Africa about 7,000 years ago and quickly spread to Egypt. It would then spread to the Levant, then soon to the rest of the world, becoming the defining pack animal and riding animal for the Neolithic, serving as the impetus for the domestication of the camel and horse. To quote Errett, "So who domesticated the donkey? The genetic evidence for donkeys indicates that communities in Somaliland, in the Horn of Africa, and also farther north along the Red Sea hills, apparently separately participated in the domestication of this important animal. In both regions, the local people would have spoken early languages of the Cushitic branch of the Euphrasian family. And in that branch, we can track a word distinguishing domestic donkeys from wild donkeys back to a period roughly in the range of 5000 BC, consistent with the genetic dating of domestic donkeys and with their appearance after 4000 BC in the archaeological record in Egypt. Another notable animal species also spread from inner Africa to the Nile Valley, this time from West Africa, that being the helmeted guinea fowl. This barnyard bird would become a staple of ancient Egyptian life and cuisine, and can be seen on everything from tomb walls to pottery to cosmetic palettes, and would eventually be spread far from its African roots to Europe and Asia. This important fowl, which had been present in Egypt since the pre-dynastic, was first domesticated in ancient Nigeria. To quote Shin, Among the domestic helmeted guinea fowl populations in our study, the domesticated helmeted guinea fowl from Nigeria has the highest levels of genetic diversity and LD decay rate, but the lowest levels of ROHs, further integrating the results of gene flow and demographic changes. We hypothesize a single domestication event in West Africa, which appears to have occurred after the split of wild and domesticated helmeted guinea fowl around 5,500 years ago, but before the divergence of domesticated helmeted guinea fowl 1,300 years ago. During this period, a roughly 12-fold population bottleneck occurred. The genetic diversity was decreased, but the levels of LD and ROHs were increased. This scenario overlaps with the domestication and diffusion inferred by genomic data of Pearl Malay during 5,889 years ago, and African rice during 3,200 years ago in West Africa. The domestication of helmeted guinea fowl and some Western African crops likely mirror each other, which are ascribed to cultural responses to the transition from a green Sahara to the desert and subsequent climate changes. But besides domesticated crops and domesticated animals, many customs and traditions are shared between the ancient Egyptians and their African neighbors. As we know, the Egyptians were a mixture of different Africans coming primarily from two places, the Green Sahara and the Sudan. Thus, many of these customs and traditions can first be seen in the Green Sahara. Many of these cultural practices are still in use by the Egyptians and their African neighbors to this day. One such pan-continental practice is that of traditional African stick fighting. Today, this traditional martial art is known as tatib in Egypt, and while today it is more of a ceremonial dance between two competitors, accompanied with live music, in ancient Egypt it was a much bloodier affair and a true martial art, tatib being a part of the rigorous training of Egyptian warriors. The origin of stick fighting lie deep in the African past, and the more martial aspect of this traditional African stick fighting can still be seen amongst the Omo of Ethiopia. The Omo take part in the Donga, a fierce and bloody exhibition of fighting skill that bears a striking resemblance to the martial arts of the ancient Egyptians. This traditional African martial art can also be seen amongst the descendants of Western and Central Africans in the diaspora of the Caribbean, where it is known as Kalinda. Like its Egyptian cousin, the use of music is accompanied by two combatants as they take part in a stick fighting competition, although this West African version is far more physical. While Kalinda is accompanied by music, it is not a play fight as tatib is today in Egypt. It is a true martial art with actual physical contact. And like tatib or the donga, it is viewed by large crowds and is a key element of local festivities, being part dance, part ritual, and part martial art. The music genre calypso actually originates from this traditional African stick fighting. While the more performative version of tatib is more well known in Egypt, there are still practitioners of this ancient African martial art that try to preserve its ancient combative roots, teaching it in its true martial art form. One such practitioner preserving these ancient African traditions is Master Hani Hassan from Upper Egypt, who is a grand master of tatib and teaches it in its traditional martial art form, and happens to be a proud black Egyptian.
Egypt now, where an ancient martial arts known as tatib has been passed on from one generation to another for hundreds of years. It's now a UNESCO recognized heritage sport that is still popular in Egypt but has evolved over the years. CGTN's Adel El Marouki has more on this unique sport.
Estimated to be 5,000 years old, Tahtib was one of the most popular sports in Egypt. In the rural Egyptian south, it is known as the pride of men. It's a bloody sticks martial art that in ancient times required inflicting serious injury to opponents, often ending in tragedy.
There are 8 formations in Tahtib. There are like kata in karate or styles in kung fu. Pointing systems is based on technique when performing these formations. Then in improvisation attacks, that's about the proper handling of the stick, defending a hit correctly and conducting one. It's usually a one-on-one game, but there is a defense mode where there are more than one fighter attacking and the defender is credited with points.
إن أكتر من قسم وفي التحطيب.
Passed on from one generation to the other, tahtib has gradually evolved from a military-type survival technique into a non-lethal sport.
لو وصلت للراس
Today, if the stick touches the head, the player must freeze, and that's considered a knockout. It's forbidden to hit the joints or bones. Hitting must go to a muscular body part. In modern tahtib, if the opponent's stick drops, that's also an additional point. It's a very enjoyable game.
In 2016, UNESCO designated it as heritage sport, but there are fears the sport is fast fading away.
يعني إحنا طبعاً بعيد عن الصعيد شوية إحنا مش.
There are only 5 modern tahtib trainers in Egypt. I am one of them. We try to preserve that heritage. Honestly, there is little interest in the cities. There are still few festivals in Upper Egypt, but there is little interaction between us. Theirs are usually for stage performances.
مدرسة التحطيب المصري الحديث هاني حسن.
Tahtib stick is much thicker and heavier than other stick martial arts that require great muscular support for an adrenaline sport. It's one of the 7 oldest combat games in Egypt's earliest civilization. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
Being that the ancient Egyptians were a cacophony of several different Africans from several different regions, there is lots of shared material culture between ancient Egyptians and other African cultures. One such object is the headrest. These beautifully ornate objects are used to support the head and neck while at rest, and are also used to protect certain elaborate hairstyles. These beautiful works of craftsmanship are found throughout the African continent, and of course in ancient Egypt. The headrest was an important aspect of burial rites not only in Egypt, but throughout Africa as well. To quote Green, some Africans equipped the deceased with a headrest during burial. In ancient Egypt, the Book of the Dead describes headrests as elevating, preserving, and protecting the deceased head. Egyptian headrests also evolved into miniature symbolic funerary amulets that were placed inside a mummy's wrappings. Ancient Nubian headrests were more than mere tomb furnishings and actually supported the deceased's head. In other areas of Africa, the headrest of a deceased important person is buried in that person's stead if the deceased body is unavailable, as occurs amongst the Luba people of Zaire. Another piece of shared material culture is the traditional African collar. These beautifully elaborate decorated collars span the entire continent and were a staple of ancient Egyptian dress. Given the very hot climate of Egypt and most of Africa, people would usually wear these traditional African collars topless, in the nude, or perhaps with a sash, a skirt, or a tunic. This was common attire throughout Africa, given the very hot climate. We can still see the use of these traditional African collars throughout the continent, especially amongst the Bantu groups of South Africa or the Maasai of East Africa. Also, we see the use of these beautiful collars on ancient art from the Yoruba, such as these sculptures of the Oni or kings of the Yoruba. And of course, we can see this same use of the traditional African collars on the ancient pharaohs and royalty of Egypt. These traditional African collars being a staple of African attire that spans the continent. Another piece of shared material culture is, of course, the traditional Afro comb. These distinctive combs, made especially for thick, kinky African hair, are found throughout the continent. Usually engraved with beautiful and elaborate designs, they were sometimes worn in the hair as a status symbol or simply as a stylish accessory, very similar to the way many African Americans wear Afro picks till this day. Some of the most beautiful examples of these distinctive Afro combs can be found in West Africa, and one of the oldest examples of the Afro comb can be found here in the Nile Valley, deep in the Sudan, dating back to over 7,000 years ago. At Kedruka, we find some of the earliest Afro combs in Africa. Far before the pharaohs, these beautiful Afro-pick combs were buried lovingly in the graves of these early Sudanese. It's these Sudanese migrants that would migrate into the Egyptian side of the Nile Valley in about 4,400 BC. Known as the Badarians, these early Nubians would bring several inventions from Sudan into Egypt, as well as their distinctive Afro-pick combs. It's these early Sudanese migrants that would kickstart pharaonic civilizations, becoming the first pharaohs of ancient Egypt. The Afrocomb becoming a revered grave good and an unmistakable African element of ancient Egyptian society. When one does a thorough study of ancient Egyptian art, you immediately find that the afro is one of the most pervasive elements of ancient Egyptian art. We see countless depictions of ancient Egyptians with large, beautiful afros, whether that be on the queens of Egypt or the kings of Egypt, whether that be on soldiers or officials, and simply countless works of art showing Africans with these beautiful, distinctive afros.
Burial pits in the Nile Valley have been the source of rare and unique artifacts dating back more than 6,000 years. They show a rich, creative culture. These prestige items were crafted by artisans to be enjoyed by elites.
How old is this?
So this dates to about 3,600 BC.
Really? This is 6,000 years ago.
Yes.
So the brothers and sisters back in the Nile Valley were combing out their hair with an afro comb.
Yeah. Just like afro combs, these long, thick combs would have been perfect for African hair. And this is an item that would proclaim status and identity and make a statement. They're often found in the burials, still in the hair, very prominently placed. So these symbols would have been visible.
Just the way black people wear them today.
Absolutely.
Black people were combing their hair with afro combs. I thought we invented this in the 60s. Amazing.
So the burials at that date were pit burials in the dry sand often that preserves organic materials. We can actually do an archaeology of hairdos and hairstyles.
Oh, what kind of hairstyles?
They've got all sorts. We've got the use of henna and fake hair and big bouffants. There's even a suggestion we've got some mohawks as well.
It's astonishing.
So the people who made this were highly skilled craftspeople. They were making beautiful pottery, very skilled at making stone vessels, all up and down the Nile Valley at this time. We see groups creating very vibrant, personal culture that they would wear and display.
This is the Egyptian Gallery, or one of the Egyptian galleries at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, and I wanted to start off here because this is where the project started. One particular object that's been on display for the last 20 or 30 years actually inspired the Afro Comb project. The comb dates to around 5,000 or 5,500 years ago, and it's very typical of the type of combs that we see from early Egypt. The teeth are very long. They have quite wide gaps in between, and as you can see from the comb, one of them is actually broken, probably because it was used. At the top of the comb, it's quite interesting because I suppose in some respects it's a parallel to the black fist that you see on a lot of modern afro combs. We see an ancient symbol. It seems to represent bull's horns, and this particular symbol was quite common in early Egypt, and it represents fertility and also strength. It's a very masculine symbol, and so perhaps the person who was buried with this comb could have been a man. We're not sure because we don't have the excavation reports to tell us. If we look at some other objects, again from the same period, we can see very similar symbolisms or motifs appearing on the pottery. If you have a look at the pot, you can see an early man, probably a hunter-gatherer, and he's standing very close to a boat, probably on the River Nile. And in between him and the gazelle that he's hunting, you can see a standard or what looks like a flagpole. And on the top of that pole is exactly the same symbol that you see on the top of the comb. Hairstyles were very important to both men and women in ancient Egypt, and we have lots of examples here in the galleries. But I wanted to look at one example in particular that dates to about 3,800 years ago, which represents a woman wearing a type of hairstyle that was very, very popular at the period. And similar to people in modern days, there were fashions of hair in ancient Egypt and also in ancient Sudan. This particular hairstyle is known as a Hathor hairstyle. It's quite often called a Hathor wig. And that's because it's associated with a goddess who was called Hathor, who was linked and associated with fertility, and was also linked with women and leading them through to the afterlife. So what we're trying to do as part of the project is to look at links between different African cultures over, of course, geographical region, but also across time. One quite remarkable similarity that we don't know and can't say whether it was directly linked or not, but whether or not I think it's still of considerable interest, is the similarity between a rather peculiar and distinctive crown that ancient Egyptian kings wore called the blue crown. Now you can see here that Ramesses II, and this is an image of a statue in Turin in the Egyptian Museum, is wearing the blue crown. And if you have a look closer, you can see that there are tiny depictions of concentric circles on the crown. Now, a different period, but still this region of Africa, in the Meroitic period in Sudan, when you see this type of depiction, it normally represents afro hair on the Meroitic Sudanese rulers about the period of about 200 AD. What's remarkable is that in the 1950s, the photograph on the right-hand side was taken, and this shows a member of the Watutsi people, and the hairstyle is incredibly like the form of the blue crown. Now, as I said, we can't make a direct link between the two, but nevertheless I think this particular instance and the similarity between the two styles is quite remarkable. Another hairstyle that we find commonly in lots and lots of different African cultures across time is the side lock, and this was associated with young people, particularly boys. On the right hand side you can see an image of a young boy with his mother, and in fact the mother's actually wearing her hair styled in the Hathor hairstyle, and she's holding on to her son protectively. And on the left hand side you can see an archive photograph from Namibia, and it shows a young boy with a side lock. Now what would happen at the time of puberty is the side lock would actually be cut off, or in some cases would be incorporated into a different hairstyle. So what this symbolises is the side lock of youth, and it's something that we find for thousands of years in Africa.
As we know, there are stone-built ruins all throughout Africa, from the ancient dry stone cities of the Empire of Ghana and the ancient Neolithic cities of Tichit in West Africa, to the rock-cut churches of Lalibela and the ancient ruins of the Aksumite Empire in Ethiopia, to the ancient dry stone cities of Great Zimbabwe and the ancient Bokoni ruins of South Africa. And of course, there is Egypt, which is perhaps the best known of all these sites. Building megalithrically in stone is a tradition shared throughout the African continent, and of course was widespread in the age of the Green Sahara. We find massive settlements built in stone, monoliths and large stone edifices throughout the now barren Sahara. These ancient stone monuments are the precursor to the stone building traditions found throughout Africa. Thus, there are several construction principles that are shared by Africans throughout the continent, as well as certain structures and objects. One such object is the obelisk. These large granite pillars were erected to mark the grave of fallen kings, and are found prevalently in ancient Egypt, but they are also found elsewhere in Africa. One such place is here, in Nigeria. This large Nigerian obelisk is known as the Staff of Aranmian, and like its Egyptian cousin, it's made of a solid piece of granite. And of course, in Ethiopia, we also find these massive obelisks. These large stone grave markers are also constructed out of solid pieces of granite. It should be noted that granite is one of the hardest stones on earth. The only thing harder than granite is quartz and diamond. All of these ancient African societies could work in granite, whether that be the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Nigerians, or the ancient Ethiopians. So why did all of these ancient African societies erect obelisks out of this extremely hard material? That's because they're all related. They all have a shared Saharan ancestry. It should also be noted that the predecessor to the Great Pyramids and mastaba tombs of ancient Egypt are the Tamuli graves of the Green Sahara. This tradition will be continued for millennia in Africa, stretching from West Africa to the Sudan. It should be noted that the ancient Nigerians did not only erect obelisks, but prior to the British colonization, they had also constructed several earthen pyramids known as the Insude. Some of these earth and clay pyramids stood as high as 30 feet. The presence of earthen pyramids in Nigeria is not surprising at all, as we know the tradition of monarchic Tamuli building was shared between West Africa and the Middle Nile region. To quote Faraji, in his discussion of the Sudan, referring to Western Sudan, Hansberry describes the tombs, that is, the Tamuli of the Niger River Basin, as those strange and most interesting structures of the Sudan. Hansberry commented on the presence of these monumental mounds throughout the Sudanic corridor. All through the Sudan, and especially in Nigeria, are to be found great conical dome-shaped structures of baked clay, ranging in size from 16 feet in height and 66 feet in basal diameter to 70 feet in height and 220 feet in basal diameter. These large Tamuli graves could also be found in pre-dynastic Egypt. To quote Faraji one more time, British Egyptologist Toby Wilkinson more recently excavated at a First Dynasty royal tomb, substantiating that the construction of Tamuli was not an irregularity in early dynastic Egypt. Wilkinson comments on the significance of the mound architecture. The superstructures of the mid and later First Dynasty tombs from the reign of Jet and onwards apparently comprised two elements, a hidden tumulus over the burial chamber and a larger mound covering the whole tomb. The hidden tumulus was entirely contained within the grave pit and was itself covered by the large grave mound. Consequently, it can have fulfilled no architectural purpose and must therefore have been a symbolic function. The provision of not one but two tumuli suggests that the symbol of the mound had great importance for the deceased. It may eventually have been regarded as essential for the resurrection of the dead in the grave. As a highly symbolic feature, the hidden tumulus also found its way into the contemporary mastabas at North Saqqara. Early dynastic Egypt was, at least in terms of the construction of the royal mound tumuli, wholly within the Sudanic Sahelian tradition, and therefore the later triangular pyramids for which ancient Egypt is popularly known represented a divergent practice from its Sudanic and Sahelian roots, an architectural innovation inspired by the earlier construction of mound tumuli. The links between Sudanic Sahelian tumuli and Nile Valley pyramids is very apparent. And it is important to reiterate Rachel J. Dan's assertion that the tradition of tumulus burial was earlier than the pyramid and stretched back into the mortuary practices of the Sudan. The tumulus burial was the predecessor to the pyramid. Another shared practice that came along with monarchic tumuli construction was the practice of ritual suicide, where upon the king's death, several high-ranking vassals and servants would be interred with the king in mass graves. This tradition has its origin deep in the Neolithic of the Sudan and was shared with their West African neighbors.
Please welcome Dr. Elizabeth Miner.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to speak here tonight. So tonight I'll be speaking about my research on evidence for mass human sacrifice in the royal burials at the ancient Nubian kingdom of Kerma. First, I'll give a short background on ancient Nubia and the Kerma kingdom in general, as I know that it's an area of the world that everyone is not entirely familiar with. And then we'll look at one ancient burial community as a case study on the practice of human sacrifice. I'll look at different funerary equipment with the goal of suggesting which community groups were coerced into death with the Nubian king. The evidence suggests that when key actors in the community were selected for sacrifice, they in turn brought along their own sacrifices, giving us insight into a changing internal community relationship as the Kerma kingdom grew in socio-political complexity. And more importantly, by looking at the practice of sacrifice in its cultural context, we can move beyond seeing this solely as an overtly violent act and instead bring out new information about how this ancient African community built social relationships in life and then commemorated them in death.
This tradition persisted late into antiquity, still being practiced by ancient Christian Nubian kingdoms like Nopatia and Makuria, as well as in the ancient empires of Ghana and Mali in West Africa. Not surprisingly, as we know the early pharaohs of Egypt came from the Sudan, we not only find the practice of monumental tumuli building, but also the practice of mass ritual suicide, which was found prevalently in the pre-dynastic and the first dynasty of ancient Egypt.
A notable ritual practice, with its origins farther south, played a role in early royal observances of the Old Kingdom. During the first dynasty of Old Kingdom Egypt, royal tombs at Abydos, it now appears, contained not just the graves of the rulers themselves, but also the graves of a large number adjacent graves, a large number of high status individuals buried next to the king, apparently to accompany and look after him in the afterlife. As many as 300 people in the case of the second king, even 135 subsidiary graves in the case of the fifth ruler. So some things to be learned there and maybe tried to be better understood. Now, this ritual treatment of the king's death was similarly practiced early in Nubia, and it was a ritual feature present still in the high age of the Kerma kingdom of Upper Nubia in the 2nd millennium BCE. And more than that, this is a ritual practice that historians have encountered in the history of a number of later Nilo-Saharan speaking or Nilo-Saharan influenced kingdoms in the Sudan belt of Africa, from pre-Christian Nubia to as far west and as late as the empire of the Ghana in around the 8th or 9th, maybe as late as the 10th century CE, AD. So now Egypt in this light is best understood not as the source of the practice, but as a portion of the Middle Nile culture area that may for a time have had this custom, but not as deeply rooted maybe in local culture. It dropped back out of use. By the way, of course, we don't know that people were executed to go into the afterlife. They may each, as they've died, in their turn been buried. So we're not, we're not prejudging just how this happened. Now, want to bet? Yeah, I know, you're right. But we'll give people an opt-out if they want to. Okay.
This extreme reverence for the king would have a notable effect on how the Egyptians viewed the pharaoh, seeing him as a living god. To quote Eret, the early Old Kingdom, even with this transformation, continued to reveal the historical indebtedness of its political institutions and ritual associations to the wider Middle Nile cultural world. A particularly notable ritual practice with its origins farther south figured strongly in the early royal observances of the Old Kingdom. During the first dynasty of Old Kingdom Egypt, the royal tombs at Abydos, it appears, not only contained just the graves of the rulers themselves, but also a large number of adjacent graves of retainers and high-status individuals buried to accompany the king and look after him in the afterlife. 36 such burials in the case of Hor-Aha, and as many as 318 people in the case of his successor, Jer, 154 with the next ruler, Jet, and even 135 subsidiary graves accompanying the burial of Din, the 5th ruler. It is striking here that this ritual accompaniment of the deaths of kings similarly took place equally early farther south, and that it was a ritual feature present still in the 2nd millennium BCE during the high age of the Kerma kingdom of the Upper Nubian Nile region. This ritual practice is one that historians have encountered in the histories of a number of later Nilo-Saharan speaking or Nilo-Saharan influenced states in the Sudan belt of Africa, from pre-Christian Nubia in the first half of the 1st millennium CE to as far west and as late in time as the Ouagadougou Empire of the Ghana in the 9th century CE. Egypt, viewed in the context of these wider historical developments, is best understood not as the source of this ritual practice, but as an offshoot of the Middle Nile culture area, in which this custom took strong hold for a time, although eventually dropping out of use. But the extraordinarily deep sacredness of the royal position expressed by this kind of burial practice nevertheless persisted down into much later times, with later Egyptian kings often being called the god. This form of divine kingship is also distinctively African and is also shared throughout the continent. When we speak of kingship, there is one shared motif that many people mistake for foreign, but in fact it is a native African motif. This motif is known as the Masters of Animals. This ancient motif usually depicts a king or queen or god or goddess facing frontally, holding or controlling two beasts on each side. It is found throughout civilizations of the Near East, namely Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, but it is also found in Africa, namely in Egypt. This motif, in fact, originates in Africa, and the earliest version of it can be found on the rock paintings of the Green Sahara.
This is from Outoori, who's a Basque Egyptologist, and in this particular article, what he's trying to show is that we can sort of, quote, read Saharan paintings, and we can see similar motifs in early Egyptian art. So you have in early Saharan paintings, you have men with elephants. You don't normally think of elephants being in the Eastern Sahara, but they were there at one time. This motif, men, did he really actually, it's hard to believe the giraffes would let you do this to them, but anyway, it's there. And we see these motifs in Egyptian art. Now, some people have argued that this sort of motif, taming of the two beasts, is actually of Near Eastern origin. Well, okay, let's take the compromise position and say that you may have had traditions of the taming of the wild beast from multiple sources. But nevertheless, you do see it in the Sahara, and in the Sahara, it's older than it is in Egypt or Mesopotamia.
As we know, the Green Sahara period is the largest out-of-Africa migration since the initial out-of-Africa migration that first populated the Earth. So it's not at all surprising to find this African motif all around the Near East. As we know, Africans are amongst the founding populations of both Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley civilization. This is a beautiful example of an ancient Egyptian master of animals motif. This is Horus, standing on two crocodiles, two beasts in each hand. Note Horus's beautifully strong African features. But of course, as the master of animals motif originates in Africa, we also find the motif here in ancient Nigeria. This is an ancient Benin bronze, and we can see clearly the Oba of Benin, or divine king of Benin, grasping two leopards by the tail, one in each hand. In this plaque, his belt is made of two conjoined mudfish, this animal being sacred to the ancient Nigerians due to their ability to move in two realms, both in water and on the land. In this bronze, we can see that the Oba's legs have taken the form of the two sacred fishes, once again holding two leopards in each hand. So, as we can see, whether in Egypt or Nigeria, this ancient shared African motif persisted for millennia and speaks to the cultural continuity across Africa and between Africans, as well as the African contribution to cultures all around the world. Hey, I'm Solomon. Thanks for watching. And that's just some of the shared customs and culture between Egypt and the rest of Africa. There is tons and tons more. I could have made this video twice as long. People have written whole books on this topic, on this shared history and shared culture. I highly recommend you check out Egypt in Africa by Theodore Kalinko. It's a great book, and it has tons of essays from just giants in the field, from Egyptology to Nubiology to Africology, and will really help you develop a well-rounded understanding of African history. As I said, there's tons of things I didn't cover in this video. For example, I didn't really cover language. For example, the Yoruba and the ancient Egyptians have tons of shared words. So do the Wolof and Senegal and the ancient Egyptians. They also have tons of shared words in their respective languages. So things like that I didn't really cover in this video, but I probably will in a part 2. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching. See you guys later. Thanks.